Hi Bio20. Very last video, guys. Awesome. We got all the way to the end. Here we go. 4.2, looking at some historical ideas on the evolutionary observations of scientists, looking at how species appear to have changed over time with evidence like this fossil record, and other evidence we'll talk about. And so here we go. Couple definitions. First of all, is that a hypothesis is an explanation to an observation, some idea of what you think is the answer to that question or what you see, whereas a theory is a tested hypothesis that appears to be consistently leading to the same conclusion, so it is something that's tested over and over. So the question as we start, just to go over this, did we evolve from monkeys? Are we not stating that we're evolving from monkeys, but either that we have a common ancestors with apes, gorillas, and chimps, for example. And so scientists are saying that after the common ancestor, the species diverged into separate lineages. So that is the idea there. Second one, we're not talking about evolution as the origin of life. That is not what our curriculum is actually addressing at all. We are looking at how evolution is the changes we see after the origin of life. So we see that organisms have micro-evolved or evolved with evidence like fossils, but we're looking at how that happened and why that happened. Okay, so we've got some list of scientists whose ideas always help to the next scientist, and we've come across those ideas in different parts of science, and it's interesting to see where the ideas have come from and what the original ideas were. So here's some scientists to take note of. First one is Plato and Aristotle, over 2,000 years ago, who wrote about the fact that they believe all life is now as it always was. So they thought it's perfect and unchanged, and that was their idea. Buffon, his idea in his published Histoire Naturelle said that humans and apes may have a common ancestor, and that Earth may be older than the 6,000 years that some people believe. Next guy, Cuvier, he was the guy associated with paleontology, and he's the one who looked at fossils and layers of rock in sedimentary rock, which are strata. And he looked at those fossils and said they got more and more different as you go deeper, and sometimes there would be new species that are now extinct that would be discovered. He thought that maybe some catastrophes over time may have caused those extinctions, but he was actually had fossil evidence, so that was a pretty big deal. And of course, the older strata are the have organisms from much longer ago, and the top strata would be the more recent organisms. Okay, number 4, Lyell. He's a geologist, and he thought that geological events were slow and continuous. And so he basically was against the catastrophe idea, but he did say that he thought that the Earth was more than 6,000 years old as well. And number 5, Lamarck looked at fossils and compared that to species he could find that were alive, and he looked at their line of descent, and he said that as they, over time, they got more and more perfect to survive current environmental conditions. So that was kind of interesting. But he also had the idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics. So that's an interesting one, where he believed that features that were acquired in your lifetime, like working out and getting big muscles, or losing a finger or something, those would then be passed on to offspring. So that was his idea. He knew there was a passing on of features to offspring. And although he had faulty conclusions, the idea of passing adaptations to offspring, that important concept, was what made him famous, because that led to the natural selection idea that came after him by Lamarck and Darwin. Darwin and Wallace. So Lamarck's idea of acquired characteristics is that if these giraffes were having to eat leaves further and further up and stretch their necks and had longer necks, that would be why their babies were born with longer necks, because those acquired characteristics could be passed down to successive generations. Okay, and we're going to finish off with Darwin and Wallace. Darwin, famous for getting on the Beagle and spending a few years looking at a whole bunch of different places in the world. He mapped South American coastline. He went to the Galapagos Islands, and it was there that he made a lot of documented observations and decided that when Lamarck said there was an inheritance of traits, he agreed with that. And he thought that those individuals that survived and had babies had some adaptation or competitive edge that made them more fit for the environment, which is why they lived and went on to breed and have offspring with those same adaptations. So what made him very famous is his papers that he wrote, The Origin of Species by Natural Selection, 1859. And the big ideas was that present life came from descent and modification from some ancestral species, and that the mechanism for modification is natural selection. So those that are best suited to survive are the ones that live, have babies, and pass those on. So the idea here is those with the longer legs get the food, or they are smart because they stand on the other guy. Those who get the food will be the ones that survive to have babies who then have longer legs, like the ones who got the food. Okay, and in this picture, we're looking at how, going from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, how the tree dwellers were eaten by the birds, and so those adapted to pop into the ground and survive the birds are the ones who populated the next generation and were ground dwellers. So you can watch this cool video about Darwin's voyage and how studying the finches, which he saw on every island, except they were adapted to have different beaks for different food that was on those islands. That's where he got a lot of his ideas about natural selection. So they had adapted to the food source, and so much so that the finches were now all a little bit different, were now new species and couldn't interbreed, but he believed there was some common ancestral species that they all diverged from. So Wallace came up with the same ideas, and so if you hear about Darwin and Wallace, they both had a similar idea about natural selection. It's just that Darwin has much more notoriety due to all of his observations, his travels, and his documentations. Okay, so we're going to look at further evidence of evolution. One of them, first one being the fossils, which is a really big evidence. And sedimentary rocks are the ones that have the most fossils, that of course are in chronological order, with the oldest ones further down and the younger ones at the surface, like we mentioned. And so when we look at what we have found, it's been put into a geologic timescale to compare when these had existed in the Earth's history. You can see that we have the order of Precambrian, the oldest age, and then the three eras Paleozoic, that was had the first little inverts, as well as vertebrates, fishes, plants, amphibians, and then seed plants and cone-bearing plants. Then the middle or Mesozoic era, that was well known for its dinosaurs, Jurassic and Triassic periods. birds and flowering plants and mammals. And then current or Cenozoic era is where placental mammals and humans are found in our geologic time scale. And I think if you know about the three eras, in particular the one that you exist in, that will be about as much as you really have to know about the geologic time scale. We know that there's been some excellent fossils that were found in the Burgess Shale fossil beds in BC, and they have fossils of creatures that, like this trilobite, that are now extinct. Transitional fossils are ones that link ones that we found before, older ones, like this Pakicetus with nostrils at the front, and connect that to the beluga, for example, with nostrils at the top. And they always felt that there was some missing link or transitional fossil that will show that they descended, that the beluga descended from Pakicetus, and that was located. This is a great example of actually finding the missing link. And Etocetus was located to have the nostrils at the middle of the skull, so they believe that this is showing this lineage. And these are actual pictures of these three creatures. So it went from this guy to the beluga. So they're kind of cool to see the representation of what they think they look like. This is that middle guy. Okay, so, and this is where they, when the nostril thing, how they believe that the land animals just could have been over time changed into this like beluga, the killer whale that we have now. So there's some ideas that you can examine. Okay, second evidence would be biogeography, looking at the whole world and looking at where the fossils even existed and looking at continental drift. So often there's fossils that are similar in two areas, and then if we looked at how that could have, those continents could have been together during Pangaea and then separated, we can see why those similar fossils were found in those continents, because maybe they were at one time one land mass, and plate tectonics suggest that those plates of the earth have moved and continue to move. And so they say marsupials, for example, are found in the Americas, Australia, New Guinea. So then maybe they were that way because of the time when we had the landmass called Gondwana. And so that explains that. We're going to talk about anatomy. This is an important one. We're looking at now homologous and analogous structures. And so the word analogous, meaning different, and the word homologous, meaning the same, means that there's things that had a common ancestor, but now their parts have adapted to have different jobs. So remember that the word homologous and analogous means the ancestry. So for homologous, same ancestry would be like this leaf that has an ancestry structure of being a leaf, but it has now different functions in those plants, like spikes or colored leaves or Venus flytrap of snapping, or a pitcher plant that holds water. So this would be a homologous structure. And similarly, we see the number of digits here are all the same in these homologous structures, but now they have adapted to be fins or feet or wings or, so hands. So we've got these good examples of homologous, remaining the same, but same ancestry, but different now. So same ancestry, but different structures now. On the other hand, analogous, they means that they do not have the same ancestry. Analogy means that they are different. So for the analogous structures, they would be that the ancestry is different, but now they both use those structures for the same thing. So the insects and birds both use their wing for flying, but in embryological or body structure wise, they would be different. ancestrally. So looking at my kind of review note on this, remember that those two words, analogy and homology, mean the ancestral origin. So if they've got homologous structures, that means they are similar in origin, but now they have adapted to evolve to have different functions, like limbs that are all the same in elements. However, now they all have different functions. You guys should need to know this page. Okay, and analogous, remember that means different in ancestral origin. So different origin, but now they have similar functions like owl wing and insect wing in their body structure. There's no similar origin at all. They're different origins, but both of them use them to fly now, same as the bird wing and bat wing. So analogous, meaning they're different origin, now used for the same thing. Homologous, same origin, but now used for different functions. Okay, so very important part of this chapter. Make sure you know those two terms. The word vestigial features, things that we are not using anymore, but are in our anatomy. They don't serve any function now. Things like, you can't see this page very good, it's from the Discover magazine. Things like extra ribs or wisdom teeth that can be removed, or appendix, or baby toe, or extra tendons, all sorts of things that part of the population have and part do not. So those are considered vestigial structures. Next one, embryology, is a look at embryos and trying to compare whether we are closely related by embryological evidence. And so looking at, for example, fish, chicken, pig, and human, some similarities suggest that they could be some common ancestor between some of these species. However, these Haeckel's embryos have come with a lot of controversy. If you want to read up on that, they see that Haeckel had documented this with making his own changes to make some of the embryos look more identical. So when students have done research all over the world and chose the same embryos as Haeckel, they found that there is actually no embryological evidence that is giving crazy lineage and showing any crazy ancestral connections. So Haeckel is basically, the conclusion is, even though his study is still in our textbook, the conclusion in the last 10 years or so is that his embryological connection should not be in our textbooks. So anyway, controversy, you can check on that yourself. Check out Ernest Haeckel and his embryological studies, because they're kind of funny to read. And I have to put a K in there. It's H. Oh yeah, we'll start that over again. Ernest Haeckel. Haeckel. If you want some entertainment, check out Haeckel's embryo and embryos and all the controversy that's associated with those. Okay, molecular biology. Last one is about how all organisms have the same molecules in DNA. There's DNA in all living things. All the cells have similar cell components. We all have enzymes that control our reactions. Our proteins are all made of amino acids, and all our cells have DNA. So that shows a connection between all life. Genetics is the field of how genes are inherited by the babies from the parents, and alterations and mutations can be passed on by natural selection if they help that organism adapt to their environment. So there you go. Okay, my friends, a little Finch's study. That's a cool video to check out. Thanks for joining me.